Chapter 2 The Storm Breaks. Section 1 The Fiction Flood. The first significant excitement of the British Secret Service's war came in November 1939. A document, later known as the Oslo Report, was sent anonymously to the British legation in Norway, then forwarded to London by its naval attaché. The parcel that reached Broadway contained several pages of German typescript and a small cardboard box. It represented the outcome of an earlier feeler message to the legation, saying that if the British wanted to receive details of new scientific developments in Germany, they should make a minor change in the wording of a BBC broadcast to Germany. Instead of starting, "Hello, this is London calling," it was to say, "Hello, hello, this is." This was duly done, and after a short delay, the Oslo Report was submitted. Its narrative covered a remarkable range of enemy activities. The anonymous author asserted that the Germans were developing acoustic and radio-controlled torpedoes, detailed the wavelengths on which German radar stations were operating, suggested bombing the Luftwaffe research station at Reichlin, and much else. The box contained a trigger tube to be employed for new anti-aircraft shell proximity fuses, but the credibility of the whole document was undermined by the inclusion of two nonsenses: a claim that the Luftwaffe's Ju-88 bombers were being produced at the impossible rate of 5,000 a month, and that a German aircraft carrier, the Franken, was approaching completion at Kiel. These mistakes contributed to a verdict by Whitehall that the document should be dismissed as a German plant. But the report was also read by Dr. Reginald Jones, the outspoken, combative 28-year-old assistant director of Air Ministry Scientific Intelligence. Jones shines forth as an authentic star in the wartime secret firmament. He was a social hybrid, son of a sergeant in the Grenadier Guards who displayed the precarious brilliance at his South London school, and later proved as much at ease holding forth at ground country house parties as fighting his corner in meetings chaired by the Prime Minister. Having had a notable early career in physics and astronomy at Oxford, where for a time he worked under Frederick Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, he became fascinated by the possibilities of exploiting infrared technology for the detection of aircraft, and in 1936 went to work for the Air Ministry. He was intolerant of slow-mindedness or bureaucracy wherever he encountered it, and there was plenty of both at Broadway Buildings, where after a brief stint at Bletchley Park, he was invited to share an office with Fred Winterbotham. In the course of the war, Reg Jones became one of the foremost British investigators of German air technology. In November 1939, however, his achievements still lay in the future, and he was seen in Whitehall simply as a pushy young boffin who seemed too free with his opinions in the presence of senior officers. Jones, almost alone, elected to believe that the Oslo document was authentic. His instinct became a near certainty in the summer of 1940, when the Luftwaffe began to use the Wotan navigational beam to guide its bombers over Britain, exploiting principles mentioned by Oslo's author. R.V. Jones, as he is known to posterity, found the information invaluable in devising countermeasures during the Battle of the Beams that influenced the Blitz, which gained him the ear and admiration of Winston Churchill. Again and again, through the years that followed, when the British gained hints about new German weapons, the acoustic torpedo for example, Jones was able to point out to service chiefs that Oslo had warned of them. After the war, in retrospective of his own intelligence career, the scientist used the example of the 1939 document to urge that casual sources should not be treated flippantly. It was probably the best single scientific intelligence report received from any source during the war. Only after an interval of almost 40 years did Jones establish the document's authorship. It was the work of a 45-year-old German physicist named Hans Ferdinand Mayer, who adopted a scientific career after being badly wounded on his first day in action as a conscript in 1914. He has been employed by Siemens since 1922, doing work that resulted in the award of 82 patents and the publication of 47 papers, and also spent 4 years as professor of signals technique at America's Cornell University. During the interwar years, he formed a warm friendship with an Englishman working for GEC named Cobden Turner, who became godfather to Maya's second son. The German was especially impressed by a good deed when he told Turner about the tragic case of a Jewish school child disowned by her Nazi father. The Englishman arranged for the little girl to come to England, where for 8 years she lived as a member of his own family. When the international horizon darkened on what proved Turner's final visit to Germany, Maya told him that if war came, he would try to supply Britain with information about German scientific and technological progress. In late 1939, the scientist exploited a chance business trip to Norway to make good on his promise. He borrowed an old typewriter from the porter at the Hotel Bristol and composed the Oslo Report, which was dispatched in 2 parts to the British Embassy on the 1st and 2nd of November. Maya also wrote directly to Cobden Turner, suggesting further contact through an intermediary in neutral Denmark. But although this letter caused 2 British security officers to visit and question the GEC men, for reasons unknown, nothing was done to open communication with Maya. MI6's official history makes no mention of this courageous German. In August 1943, Maya was arrested by the Gestapo in his office at Siemens and charged with listening to the BBC. He was confined in Dachau, but was fortunate enough to be employed in a technical plant, where he survived the war. His brave gesture was prompted by the admiration for Cobden Turner, whom he liked to regard as a representative Englishman. Recognition of Maya's contribution, however, came only from Reg Jones. Among the reasons the Oslo Report received such a chilly reception is that it was debated in Whitehall just as the British secret community reeled in the wake of a successful German ruse. On the 9th of November 1939, during the first passive phase of the war that became derisively known as the Sitzkrieg, the 2 senior MI6 officers in the neutral Netherlands, Captain Sigismund Payne Best and Major Richard Stevens, drove with a Dutch officer in Best's Lincoln Zephyr car to a rendezvous at the Café Bocuse, situated between the Dutch and German border customs barrier at Venlo. Within minutes of their arrival, they were seized by armed men. When the Dutchman drew a pistol and fired at one assailant, he was himself shot dead. Best, Stevens, and their local driver were then hustled 150 yards to the frontier. Their kidnappers were Nazi counterintelligence officers of the SD, led by the branch's later boss, Walter Schellenberg, who was narrowly missed by the Dutch officer's bullet. The British spies were fortunate enough to keep their lives, but spent most of the rest of the war in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. In contradiction of myths about heroic silence under interrogation, Stevens and Best told their abductors what they knew about MI6, which was plenty. Its continental operations were chiefly conducted from their own Hague station. The Venlo incident, as it became known to Whitehall, derived from an approach some weeks earlier by supposedly anti-Nazi German generals eager to negotiate with Britain. MI6 became much excited by the prospect of brokering a deal, though the Foreign Office was prudently skeptical. Sir Alexander Cadogan wrote in his diary on the 23rd of October, "I think they, the German plotters, are Hitler agents." The War Cabinet was informed a week later, and Winston Churchill, then still First Lord of the Admiralty, expressed violent objections to any parley. But the government authorized MI6 to continue discussions, provided, as Cadogan strictly instructed, nothing was put in writing to the supposed dissidents. The British ignored the danger that their interlocutors would play not merely a diplomatic game with them, but a rougher one. They should have been alert to such an outcome, because the Nazis had previous form as cross-border kidnappers. In November 1939, it was symptomatic of MI6's institutional weakness that its Hague station employed Volkert van Kuttlik, an Abwehr informant, the supposed representative of the disaffected German generals. Major Schamel was in truth the RSHA's Schellenberg, whom the British officers obligingly supplied with a wireless transmitter. Either Hitler or Himmler personally authorized the kidnapping, which the British at first sought to keep secret. When an official asked Cadogan what was to be said about the brawl in Holland, the subject of fervid rumor and speculation, the permanent undersecretary ordered the issue of a D notice forbidding mention of it in the British press. Amazingly, for a fortnight after the Venlo, the German conspirators sustained a dialogue with MI6, until on November 22nd, Himmler lost interest and the Germans shut down the exchange after sending a last derisive message to Broadway. The Nazis then publicly announced that Best and Stevens had been engaged in an assassination plot against Hitler. Meanwhile, von Kuttlik's betrayal went so far undetected that he secured employment with MI5 in London, and it was very fortunate that he broke off contact with the Abwehr, perhaps for lack of means of communication, because it was within his later knowledge to have betrayed elements of the double-cross system to them. Inside Whitehall, MI6 sought to talk down Venlo, arguing that the Germans had behaved crassly by grabbing the two officers instead of sustaining a double-cross game with them. It is hard to overstate the episode's significance, however, for the future course of the Secret War. British espionage activities on the continent, such as they were, suffered a devastating blow. The Germans were able to relieve Best of a list of his station's contacts, which he had taken in his pocket to the rendezvous. The reputation of the Secret Service within the British government, not high before the debacle, afterwards sagged low indeed. Guy Little of MI5 speculated in his diary that Best, a preposterous figure who affected a monocle, might have been a double agent. The real in the woodpile. He had apparently been in fairly low water, and it was noticeable that after he became associated with Dr. Franz Fischer, a Nazi double agent in Holland, he seemed to be very well in funds. There's no reason to think Little's suspicions justified. Mere bungling was responsible for the fiasco, though Walter Schellenberg asserted later that Best was willing to be turned. Meanwhile, the Dutch were embarrassed by the revelation that one of their own intelligence officers had been complicit in a British plot, which strengthened the Nazis' propaganda hand by compromising Holland's proclaimed neutrality. A further consequence of Venlo was that the British became morbidly suspicious of any approach, and there were several later in the war, by Germans professing to represent an anti-Hitler resistance. In one sense, their caution was prudent, because most of the aristocrats and army officers who became engaged in plots against the Nazis cherished absurd fantasies about the Germany they might preserve through a negotiation with the Western Allies. Former Leipzig mayor Karl Gödler, for example, was a nationalist with views on German territorial rights in Europe that were not far short of Hitler's. Even had the Führer perished, there would have been nothing plausible for Germany's enemies to discuss with his domestic foes. At the very least, however, British paranoia about suffering a repeat of the Venlo humiliation permanently excluded MI6 from some useful sources, which the Russians and later the Americans were left to exploit. Moreover, for the rest of the war, Broadway's chiefs maintained an exaggerated respect for their German adversaries, derived from the memory of having been fooled by them in November 1939. Through the icy winter months of the phony war, the GC and CS at Bletchley struggled with the intractable Enigma problem, while Broadway's Spies produced little or no useful information about the enemy and his intentions. Kenneth Strong of War Office Intelligence wrote, "We had a continuous stream of callers from the services with an extraordinary variety of queries and requests. What were the most profitable target for air attacks in this or that area, and what effect would these attacks have on the German army? Was our information about these targets adequate and accurate? How was the German army reacting to our propaganda campaigns? I found some quite fantastic optimism regarding the effects from propaganda. The dropping of leaflets was considered almost a major military victory." Some MI6 officers went to elaborate lengths to conceal their lack of agent networks. Reg Jones cited the example of Wilfred Biffy Dunderdale, who was responsible for France, and fed to Jones's branch a succession of tasty tidbits on the German Ju-88 bomber, allegedly collected by spies. First, there was information about its engines, then its electrics, and somewhat later, its armament. Jones teased Dunderdale that he must have secured a copy of the aircraft's operating handbook, then fed extracts to Broadway, to create an impression of multiple sources. The hapless officer admitted that Jones was right, but begged him to keep his mouth shut. He could keep his bosses much more interested, he said, by drip-feeding the data. This was not the only occasion when Dunderdale, like officers of all intelligence services, sought to sex up the means by which his material had been acquired. He also produced details of German troop movements supposedly secured by agent networks, which in reality derived from French intercepts. Much could be learned from an enemy's wireless transmissions, even without breaking his codes. Through traffic analysis, the study of signal origins, volume, and call signs to pinpoint units, ships, squadrons. Useful information was also gleaned by the Y service, which was responsible for eavesdropping on enemy voice transmissions, and by breaking simple enemy codes used for passing low-grade messages. The French Forward Cryptographical Unit was based at Station Bruno, in the Château de Vignobles, located at Gretz-en-Marne-Villers, 15 miles east of Paris. Bruno received an important reinforcement following the fall of Poland. Guy Little of MI5 recorded on the 10th of October 1939 that 17 Polish cryptanalysts were seeking asylum in Britain. Bletchley Park shrugged dismissively that it had no use for them, even though its chief Alistair Denison had met some of the same men in Warsaw a few months earlier, and knew that their claims to have penetrated Russia and German ciphers can, to some extent, be maintained. Denison suggested that they would be more useful at the Château de Vignobles, working with Gustave Bertrand, which was where they were sent. Though Bletchley later changed its mind and tried in vain to get them back. It was at Bruno, on the 17th of January 1940, that the ex-Warsaw Group broke its first wartime Enigma signal. By 11th of March, Colonel Louis Rivet, head of the French Secret Service, was writing in his diary, "The decrypts of the Enigma machine are becoming interesting and numerous." During the months that followed, however, material was read far too slowly, out of real time, to influence events on the battlefield. Instead, Allied intelligence officers strove to make sense of a jumble of human warnings of varying degrees of plausibility about when Hitler intended to strike in the West. The first of these had come in the previous November, when Major Gisbert Sass, Dutch military attaché in Berlin, received a dramatic tip-off from his friend Colonel Hans Oster of the Abwehr. The Wehrmacht, said Oster, would launch a full-scale offensive against the British and French armies on the 12th of that month. This coincided with several other identical or similar warnings, including an important one from Colonel Moravetz's Czechs in London, relayed by their man in Switzerland from Agent A54, the Abwehr's Paul Tommel. When nothing happened on the 12th of November, the British and French chiefs of staff assumed that they were victims of Nazi disinformation. The Dutch already suspected Sass of being a double agent, and the credibility of the other sources, including A54, suffered accordingly. Yet the warnings were correct. Hitler had indeed intended to strike in November. He was enraged that his generals insisted upon a last-minute postponement until spring, because the army was unready to move. Here was a vivid illustration of a precept later advanced by a British Army intelligence officer. Perfect intelligence in war must of necessity be out of date, and therefore ceases to be perfect. We deal not with the truth, but with the likely. The next excitement took place one day in January 1940. Thick fog caused a German courier aircraft flown by Major Erich Hoenmans to forced land in neutral Belgium. Local police arrested the pilot and his passenger, an officer named Reinberger, interrupting them as they attempted to burn papers they carried, and retrieved the charge sheets from a stove. Within 48 hours, the French and British high commands were reading the Wehrmacht's plan for its intended invasion of France and the Low Countries, focused on a thrust through Holland and Belgium. Here was a textbook example of a genuine intelligence coup, with wholly unhelpful consequences. The French were confirmed in their conviction that the Germans would attack through Belgium as they had done in 1914, and as all France's deployments anticipated. The British suspected an enemy deception. The material seemed too good to be true. Guy Little of MI5 wrote wearily on 14th of January, "A German aeroplane came down in Belgium, with certain papers found on the pilot indicating projected attack by the Germans on Belgium and Holland. It looks rather as if this may have been part of the scheme for the War of Nerves." Cadogan, at the Foreign Office, described receiving complete plan of German invasion of the Low Countries. Very odd, but one can't ignore these things, and all precautions taken. Kenneth Strong wrote ruefully afterwards, "So often I have heard it said that if we only had the plans of the other side, things would be simple. When they actually came our way, we found great difficulty in persuading ourselves that they were genuine. Most important, however, the capture immediately forfeited all virtue, because the German proprietors of the plan knew that the Allies had it. Thus, Hitler insisted on changing the invasion concept to thrust instead through the Ardennes, which proved the one authentic strategic inspiration of his life. Here was another critical lesson about intelligence, especially important for codebreakers. Captured material became worthless if its originators discovered that it was in enemy hands. Alexander Cadogan noted in his diary for January 19, 1940, that Stuart Menzies now seemed to expect the Germans to attack soon after 25th of January, and added dismissively, "But he's rather mercurial and rather hasty and superficial, like myself." If this remark somewhat short-changed the diarist, it was scarcely a ringing endorsement of C. There was one further strand. Low-grade Abwehr messages decrypted by MI5's radio intelligence service offered indications about the looming onslaught. At that time, however, machinery was lacking to analyze such material, to feed it into the military command system, and ensure that notice was taken by commanders. In that pre-ultra universe, politicians, diplomats, and generals were chronically skeptical about intelligence of all kinds. When a new warning reached MI6 via Morovich's London checks, that Abwehr officer, Paul Tummel, expected a great Wehrmacht thrust on the 10th of May. It vanished in the welter of noise that spring. The 9th of April German invasion of Norway caught the Western Allies totally by surprise. Though no decrypts were available, the Admiralty ignored or misread plentiful clues about Hitler's intentions. When the Wehrmacht's amphibious forces began to land on the Norwegian coast, the Royal Navy's major units were far away, awaiting an anticipated breakout into the Atlantic by German battleships. Through the weeks that followed, Wehrmacht eavesdroppers easily tracked the British brigades struggling to aid the little Norwegian army, while intelligence learned little or nothing about the invaders' lightning movements. On the 10th of May, 1940, Hitler launched his Blitzkrieg in the west. The Panzers swept through the Ardennes, across the Meuse, and thence to the Channel coast, and into the heart of France. Much of the information sent back from the front by French units was so fanciful that a headquarters intelligence officer, André Boiffre, dismissed it contemptuously as a fiction flood. General Maurice Gamelin, the Allied commander-in-chief, rejected every report that contradicted his obsessive belief that the Germans still planned to make their main attack through Belgium. The campaign proved a triumph for the German Army's intelligence department, as well as for its generals. An Anglophile and bon viveur, Lieutenant Colonel Ulrich Liss, headed Foreign Armies West, FHW, the Wehrmacht's principal intelligence evaluation department. Liss, who was exceptionally able and energetic, called SIGINT the darling of all intelligence chiefs, because it could be trusted as spies could not. And in May 1940, the best of it was in the hands of his own staff. During the long, static winter, German interceptors had identified the location of most of the Allies' formations, much assisted by the insecurity of the French Army's wireless operators and headquarters staffs, who often discussed plans and deployments in plain language. Colonel Handeming, Radio Intelligence's interception chief with Army Group A, was explicitly commissioned to monitor the French 7th Army's advance into Belgium, which he did with notable efficiency. Liz's men also benefited from securing vast numbers of Allied prisoners. All armies gleaned much from POW interrogation. Throughout the war, even if few prisoners knowingly betrayed secrets, amid the shock of capture, most gave their captors more than the regulation name, rank, and number. Rommel's intelligence staff found that British prisoners talked freely until a late stage of the North African campaign. One of Montgomery's officers enthused to the Germans, with almost insane indiscretion, that 8th Army's radio monitoring service was brilliant in every respect. A German wrote that British officers were repeatedly captured, carrying important lists, codes, and maps. It was a standard technique for intelligence officers to engage POWs in apparently innocent conversations about non-military subjects. The Wehrmacht's guidelines for the interrogation of English prisoners of war, dated Berlin, 16th of April, 1940, urged commanders, whenever possible, to use interrogators familiar with Britain and the British. If cordially addressed, said the briefing note, every Englishman will at once answer all questions entirely frankly. Beyond immediate tactical issues, the Intelligence Department advised, special value is set on probing prevailing economic and social circumstances in England. Answers to the following questions are useful. A. What are you told about Hitler? B. What are you told about the Nazis? C. What are you told about the Gestapo? D. What are you told about the Jews? E. What are you told about food conditions in Germany? F. What are you told about military successes? G. How do you make propaganda? H. How are women and children cared for? I. Do you take care of elderly parents no longer able to work whose sons are soldiers? K. What is the food situation, especially meat, vegetables, eggs, butter, and bread? L. What do you think of the blackout? M. Who is currently the most popular man in England? N. What do you consider the most forceful personality in the British cabinet? O. Do you listen to German radio? P. Do you like Lord Haha, the Nazi propaganda broadcaster William Joyce? Q. How are your relations with the French? R. Do you believe that Germany is bent on world conquest? S. Would you make peace tomorrow? The behavior of most POWs was strongly influenced by their own nation's immediate circumstances. At this time, when Allied fortunes were plumbing the depths, a report on the handful of German POWs in British hands recorded gloomily, the officers, and most of the men, were quite immune to propaganda. think Hitler is a god, and refuse to believe a single word of the British news. By contrast, a South African RAF pilot named Sergeant Edward Wunsch provided his German captors with a highly sympathetic view of the Nazi cause, as recorded by his interrogator. Like all South Africans who have entered Dulag Luft, Wunsch is an unashamed anti-Semite. He says there is no hatred towards Germany in South Africa, no enthusiasm for the war at all. Most people believe the nonsense press and propaganda tell them about German atrocities, but W thinks it possible that one day South Africa could agree to a separate peace if Germany continues to be militarily successful. Author's italics. The Allies lost the 1940 battle for France for many reasons. It has been a source of fierce controversy ever since, whether the French army's defeat resulted from a failure of judgment by Maurice Gamelin, Allied commander-in-chief, or instead from a national moral collapse. It is unlikely that any amount of intelligence or advance warning could have changed 1940 outcomes. The German army showed itself an incomparably more effective fighting force than the Allies, and there would be no victories until that changed. If British and French intelligence was poor in 1940, so was everything else. As the continent was evacuated, there was a late flurry of buccaneering by Secret Service officers and freelances. MI6's Major Monty Chitzen, a former head of the Hague station, rescued a priceless haul of industrial diamonds from Amsterdam. Peter Wilkinson got most of the Polish general staff out of France. Tommy Davies, a peacetime director of the Cortland's textile business, escaped from its Calais plant with a load of platinum hours before the Germans arrived. But these little coups were flea bites in the great scheme of affairs. MI6 had made no contingency plans for stay-behind agents to report from France in the event of its occupation by the Nazis, and Broadway would probably have been accused of defeatism had it done so. Through many months that followed, Britain's intelligence services were thus almost blind to events on the continent, to the frustration of the Prime Minister. Beleaguered on their island, they became dependent for knowledge of Hitler's doings on the vagaries of air reconnaissance, and reports from neutral diplomats and correspondents. The security service explored the limits of the possible and the acceptable in handling a stream of Abwehr agents who descended on Britain and were promptly captured. MI5 spurned torture as a means of interrogation, but in September 1940, at Camp 020, the service's interrogation center at Lachmere House near Ham Common, one of its officers assaulted and battered the captured Abwehr agent Tate, Harry Williamson, until he was dragged off him. Guy Little deplored this episode, saying that he objected to Gestapo methods on both moral and professional grounds. Colonel Alexander Scotland was likewise prevented from injecting Williamson with drugs. Naval Intelligence Division interrogators tested drugs on each other as a means of extracting information, and concluded that it was a waste of time. Skilled questioning, they decided, was not merely more ethical, but more effective. As the next act of the great global drama unfolded, Hitler's air assault on Britain, neither Broadway nor Bletchley Park had much to contribute. The most significant aid to fighter command in its epic struggle to repel Göring's air fleets was wireless traffic analysis of the flood of Morse from the Germans' new French, Belgian, Dutch, and Norwegian bases, together with monitoring of Luftwaffe cockpit chatter by the German linguists of the RAF's infant Y service, most of them women. The Prime Minister and the Chiefs of Staff were for many months preoccupied, even obsessed, by two questions. Would the Germans invade? And if so, when? In the mad mood prevailing in London in the autumn of 1940, a blend of heroic defiance and absurdity, the War Office's Director of Military Intelligence suggested exploiting captured Abwehr agents to try to provoke the Germans into hastening an invasion, which he felt sure could be defeated by the Royal Navy and the British Army. This proposal found no favor in Whitehall. Meanwhile, the disaster in France had endowed the Wehrmacht with almost magical powers in the minds of the generals, many of whom convinced themselves that Hitler might launch an amphibious assault on Britain with only a few weeks' preparation, offering no notice to the defenders. The Royal Navy's commander, Geoffrey Colpoys, was responsible for delivering to Downing Street each day at 1 p.m. a report from the Special Invasion Warning Committee, which for most of the autumn took it for granted that a German assault was imminent, and concerned itself chiefly with the timing. The Joint Intelligence Committee, chaired by the Foreign Office's Victor Bill Cavendish Bentinck, only once sounded the alarm to suggest that invasion was imminent, on the 7th of September, when, as Bentinck himself noted sardonically later, he himself was briefly absent, and the Army's somewhat unstable Director of Intelligence, the same man who advocated inciting the Wehrmacht to land, temporarily held the chair. Churchill himself was always skeptical about an invasion, but he deemed it politically imperative to sustain the British people's belief in the threat that not only in 1940, but throughout the following year also, to promote their vigilance and sense of purpose. On the 31st of July, Sir Alexander Cadogan expressed his own conviction that the Germans would not come, but would instead thrust at Gibraltar and Egypt, then added, "Our intelligence gives nothing to corroborate this theory, but then they're awfully bad." Nowhere in the world were British agents providing information of much assistance to the war effort. The British C&C in Singapore, Air Marshal Sir Robert Brooke Popham, wrote in frustration, "Little or no reliance is placed upon MI6 information by any authorities here, and little valuable information appears to be obtained. The same was true nearer home." For many months after the German occupation of Western Europe, the only nation still able to exploit secret sources on a large scale was the neutral Soviet Union, through its networks in Belgium, Germany, and Switzerland. In those days, its agents did not even need to trouble with wireless. They simply passed reports to their nearest Soviet diplomatic mission. In May 1940, the GRU's Leopold Trepper moved from Brussels to Paris, taking with him his mistress, the exotically named Georgie de Winter, a 20-year-old American, and leaving his deputy, Anatoly Gorevich, to arrange the Trepper family's return to Moscow. Gorevich's own personal affairs were scarcely uncomplicated. Under his cover as an Uruguayan businessman, he had a succession of girlfriends, but felt obliged to break off relations with the prettiest when she revealed that her father knew South America well. In other circumstances, he wrote wistfully, "I could probably have loved her, but such good fortune is denied to a secret agent." Thereafter, however, he formed a friendship with a neighboring family named Parksa, whose elderly Hungarian husband was married to Margaret, a much younger Belgian blonde, with an 8-year-old son. Following her husband's sudden death, Gorevich began an intense affair with her. Mikhail Makarov, the other GRU career officer in Belgium, was also leading what Gorevich described primarily as an excessively dissipated life, in which prostitutes played a conspicuous role. The German invasion of Belgium gave Gorevich some bad moments. Brussels police arrested his supposed English friend and language teacher, who turned out to be an Abwehr agent. The man was promptly liberated when his compatriots overran the capital. The GRU Network's cover company, Aroy, collapsed when its Jewish frontman fled, and the business was sequestered. Moscow ordered Gorovich to take over control of the Belgian operation. He entered Margaret Barksa on Center's books, allegedly without her knowledge, as a source unimaginatively codenamed The Blonde. The most believable aspect of his later account of the whole saga is its emphasis on the rickety-rackety nature of a spy ring that history, especially Soviet history, has dignified as one of the great secret operations of all time. Gorovich asserted that Leopold Trepper's much vaunted intelligence network in France and Belgium was composed almost entirely of his old Palestinian friends, and provided Moscow with no usable intelligence about Germany's descents on Poland, Scandinavia, or Western Europe. It seems unlikely that the Russians learned much more from its activities during the year that followed than Churchill and his generals gleaned from their morning papers. In the absence of serious British military operations, save in North Africa, secret war became a massive growth activity, impelled by the Prime Minister himself. Special Operations Executive was created in July 1940 to set Europe ablaze, while the armed forces spawned commandos, paratroopers, and a string of private armies, notably in the Middle East. New recruits of all kinds flooded into Broadway, some of them exotic. Writers of thrillers, wrote the supremely cynical Malcolm Muggeridge, tend to gravitate to the Secret Service as surely as the mentally unstable become psychiatrists, or the impotent pornographers. Thus was Graham Greene, dispatched to Freetown, Sierra Leone, Muggeridge himself, a veteran foreign correspondent, to Lourenço Marques in Portuguese Mozambique, and the journalist Kim Philby welcomed into Broadway. It became a source of dismay to career intelligence officers, protective of MI6's reputation, that its wartime recruits, who later commanded most public attention, were all either mavericks or traitors. Lacking its own agents on the continent, Broadway turned to the European exile governments in London for assistance in identifying sources. The Poles began to build impressive networks in their own country, though they suffered grievously from the fact, then of course unknown to them, that the Germans read the ciphers in which they communicated with their agents. František Moravich and his Czech group achieved formal recognition as the intelligence arm of their government. MI6 provided them with wireless facilities and documents. The Czechs established a new base in 3 little adjoining suburban houses in Rosendale Road, West Dulwich, until these were destroyed by the Luftwaffe. Then, late in 1940, moved to a new building in Bayswater. MI6 did not, however, give them money. Moravich, after spending the last of the cash he had brought out of Prague, was obliged to negotiate a loan of £50,000 to pay his network's outgoings of £3,000 a month. For some time, he continued to receive East European material via Zurich. Captain Karel Sedlacek had served as Moravich's station chief there since 1934, under cover as a newspaper correspondent. Since he lacked any literary gifts, he was obliged to pay a ghost to write copy in his name. The Abwehr's Paul Tummel used the Czech officer as his link to London. When he was arrested by the Gestapo in March 1942, Moravich's little group ran out of sources. The British enjoyed one immense piece of good fortune following their eviction from the continent. Nowhere did the Germans capture people or documents that betrayed Allied progress in cracking Enigma. Between 1940 and 1944, many Frenchmen, including hundreds of thousands of servants of the Vichy puppet regime, collaborated with their occupiers. But Vichy's military intelligence officers and several Poles attached to them, who were privy to the pioneering Enigma code-breaking operation, revealed nothing even later in the war, when they were exposed to enemy interrogation. The capacious nets cast across Europe by the Nazis focused overwhelmingly on hunting dissenters, not machines. In the early years of occupation, when most people in the conquered societies acquiesced in their fate, Berlin's spies and policemen uncovered little to ruffle their masters' complacency, and mercifully nothing that caused them to doubt the security of their own communications. In the winter of 1940 to 41, none of the principal belligerents knew much more about each other's affairs than they learned from studying the international press and watching such movements as they could see of the rival armies, navies, and air fleets. Most of the successful code-breaking that was taking place was being done by the Germans, and especially by the Kriegsmarine B-Dienst. The British lacked power to accomplish anything save the feeding of their own people. Hitler prepared to launch the most dramatic and ambitious lunge of his career, the assault on the Soviet Union, an act that could only have been undertaken by a man either bereft of accurate intelligence about the economic strength of his intended victim or recklessly indifferent to it. Section 2. Shadowing Canaris. The Germans had made themselves masters of Europe, and shown the Wehrmacht to be the most formidable fighting force in the world. By contrast, whatever the limitations of the British and other Allied intelligence services, those of Hitler's Abwehr were incomparably worse. In the summer of 1940, the chiefs of the Nazis' information-gathering machine toyed with a scheme to plant an agent on a wrecked ship off the English south coast, though they never came up with a credible notion of what such a hapless castaway might achieve there. They also discussed landing agents in Kent, who would be invited to scale the White Cliffs, a plan that was frustrated by a shortage of spies with mountaineering skills. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's intelligence department misjudged every aspect of the Battle of Britain, from respective aircraft strengths and losses to target selection. In September 1940, following the interrogations of the first enemy spies landed in Britain, Kenneth Strong of War Office Intelligence professed himself baffled. He could not reconcile his lifelong respect for German efficiency with the risible management of the Nazis' espionage activities. The Abwehr bungled the selection, training, briefing, and equipment of agents for service abroad. Seldom were they even provided with decent forged passports. It is hard to distinguish between reality and fantasy in the doings of its operational selection. Abwehr, too, because its war diary was compiled to impress higher authority, and thus included reports from agents who never existed about operations that never took place. Its chief, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, who was regarded for decades after the war as an important personality and even as a hero of the resistance to Hitler, was in reality a temporizer who lacked both the moral courage to challenge the Nazis whom he despised and the skills to run an effective secret service in their interests. The first man to grasp this was not a German, but a young English historian with a disdain for mankind in general, and professional Secret Service officers in particular. The manner in which Hugh Trevor Roper became not the nemesis of Canaris, but instead his shadow, is one of the more remarkable stories of the Secret War. The brilliant, testy, supremely arrogant Oxford Don, who, while not homosexual, professed a deep dislike of women, had just written his first book, a study of Archbishop Laud, which he often reread during the war years. I am forever discovering yet more exquisite beauties, lurking unsuspected among yet profounder truths. He spent the years between 1940 and 1945 monitoring the wireless traffic of the Abwehr, first for MI5, then for MI6. Trevor Roper lived and breathed Canaris and his organization, except on days when he went fox hunting. In growing degree, and comprehensively from 1943 onwards, the English academic learned more about Germany's intelligence services than any man in the Nazi high command knew. certainly more than Canada's himself, because Trevor Roper could identify the Abwehr's many false informants, controlled by the so-called 20 Committee of Intelligence Officers in London, chaired by MI5's Jack Masterman. In December 1939, Hugh Trevor Roper, then 25, was summoned from Merton College to work alongside Walter Gill, a lecturer in electricity who had achieved celebrity as college bursar by installing lighting in Merton's quadrangles. During World War I, Gilly had served in an army wireless section in Egypt, where he ran an aerial up the Great Pyramid. He listed his recreations in Who's Who as writing, wireless research, and rebuking sin. Now he and Trevor Roper formed the nucleus cell of the Radio Security Service, a branch of MI5 initially quartered in the cells at Wormwood Scrubs Jail in West London. Day after day, post office operators, previously employed to catch unlicensed private wireless transmissions, scoured the airwaves for signals from enemy agents transmitting from Britain, whom it would then be the role of the Merton pair to scotch. Gill and Trevor Roper found themselves frustrated by the emptiness of the ether, or rather by the absence of such traffic as they sought. They were failing, so it seemed. Only slowly did they come to understand that this was not because their own eavesdroppers were incompetent, but because no German spies were signaling home. Finding their original function redundant, on their own initiative, the two Dons widened their researches. They began to gather intercepts from stations in Europe that used known Abwehr call signs. One evening, in the flat they shared in the West London suburb of Ealing, over tea and biscuits, they cracked an Abwehr hand cipher, a lower encryption system used by Canada's bases for communication with outstations and agents lacking Enigma machines. Trevor Roper, a fluent German linguist, started to read its messages. When this came to the notice of Alistair Denniston, chief of Bletchley Park, he was not amused. The RSS's amateurs were told that they were meddling in matters of no proper concern to them. Denniston added crossly that the Abwehr material was unimportant anyways. In fairness, his dismay about the RSS's freelancing reflected more than petty jealousy. Months, indeed years, lay ahead before Bletchley's code-breaking operations achieved maturity. But from the outset, it was obvious that if the Germans gained an inkling of what was being achieved, the game would be over. The more diffused was British cryptographic activity, the greater the risk of a leak. Broadway stepped in to vent its own justified anger when it was learned that Trevor Roper's report on Abwehr activities in North Africa were circulated to a distribution list that included the post office wireless section. Gill and Trevor Roper, stubborn and mischievous men both, persisted nonetheless. They were soon reading much of the Abwehr's traffic with its outstations. To the Don's glee, even when Bletchley established its own cell to monitor the same Canada's links, it was RSS and not GC and CS, which broke the next 4 hand ciphers. In the spring of 1941, RSS acquired a new interception center with American equipment at Hanslope Park in Buckinghamshire, and began to establish its own outstations abroad. In the course of the war, the little service passed on 1 million signals to Bletchley. MI6 eventually made a successful takeover bid for RSS, which was logical, given Broadway's suzerainty over signals intelligence. Trevor Roper found himself working with Stuart Menzies' communications supremo, one of the Secret Service's more exotic figures, Colonel Richard Gambier Parry. The colonel was one of many luminaries of secret shows, who was able to exploit to his own advantage their freedom from accountability to a service hierarchy. Gambier Parry established MI6's communications center at Wadden Hall in Buckinghamshire, which he also made his personal residence. A keen horseman, he took over the pre-war owner's pack of hounds and placed the huntsman on Broadway's payroll. On one notable occasion, the hounds in hot pursuit streamed through the security gate of Bletchley Park, arousing in the mind of a mounted spectator in the know about its activities an idyllic vision of the brutes gorging on half-digested cribs. Gambier Parry lived like a medieval baron. Trevor Roper, who knew him as a fellow fox hunter, marveled, in the world of neurotic policemen and timid placemen who rule the Secret Service, he moves like Falstaff, or some figure from Balzac, if not Rabelais. It should be added that for the rest of the war, Gambier Parry ran MI6's communications with energy and flair. Hugh Trevor Roper became head of the intelligence section of MI6's Radio Analysis Bureau, run by Felix Cowgill, a former Indian policeman. Cowgill intensely disliked his new junior, whom he deemed guilty of irreverent thoughts and dangerous contacts. The Oxford historian took it upon himself to go well beyond the production of raw intelligence, conducting evaluation and analysis in a fashion MI6 had always spurned, because it lacked officers clever enough to do such work. The RAB began to produce purple primers, local guides to Abwehr personalities and agents around the world, which soon ran to many pages. The Bureau noted that the Italians, who before the war had enjoyed some notable intelligence successes, were now almost entirely dependent for material on the Germans, and thus acquired their weaknesses. In the summer of 1941, Trevor Roper acquired an assistant, 21-year-old Charles Stewart, who had just left Christ Church with a first in history, and the two were joined by another Oxford man, Gilbert Ryle. Patrick Riley, a gifted young diplomat who became Stuart Menzies' personal assistant, thought their little cell a team of brilliance unparalleled anywhere in the intelligence machine. Trevor Roper began to serve as secretary of the joint MI5-MI6 Wireless Committee, in which role he came to know almost everyone significant in the secret world. The peering, bespectacled historian became one of the outstanding British intelligence officers of the war. His mastery of German operations increased steadily, especially after Bletchley's Dilwyn Knox broke into the principal Abwehr machine cipher in December 1941. While the chiefs of Broadway believed, more so following the Venlo fiasco, that their enemies' intelligence officers were wizards of guile, from an early stage, Trevor Roper became convinced of the Germans' institutional incompetence. As for the Abwehr's chief, he said, far from being a master spy, Canaris was a lost little man drifting on the tides of fate. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris came from a family of Rhineland industrialists. After service as a U-boat officer in World War I, he became engaged in right-wing politics, while playing a role in rebuilding the German Navy. A senior officer's 1926 personal report extolled his skills at the military-political interface. With the finest feel for foreign psychology and mentality, together with uncommon linguistic ability, he knows in exemplary fashion how to deal with foreigners, from the lowest to the prominent. Interestingly, however, other naval officers, including Erich Raeder and Karl Dönitz, disliked Canaris, thinking him sly. During the early years of Hitler's rule, he ingratiated himself enthusiastically and successfully with the foremost Nazis. In 1935, aged 48, he was appointed chief of Germany's intelligence service, controlling both espionage abroad and counter-espionage at home. Though Himmler ran his own domestic security service, the RSHA, under Ernst Kaltenbrunner, with the Gestapo as its enforcement arm. As Trevor Roper noted, all German politicians of consequence sought to set up their own information bureaus, just as they also sought to establish private armies, as additional supports for their personal authority, and it was essential to the purpose of these bureaus that their results should be the private property of their chiefs. The RSHA was no more efficient than the Abwehr, but it wielded more influence through its direct subordination to Himmler. MI6 noted that it achieved good penetration of neutral embassies in Berlin, which yielded useful information. Meanwhile, Guerrillas' service had stations around the world and intelligence cells within every formation of the Wehrmacht. The admiral's early years of office saw a dramatic expansion of his empire. He achieved a reputation for administrative efficiency and diplomatic skills, both in his handling of the Nazi hierarchy and in dealing with prominent foreigners. Until at least 1942, the service's prestige stood high both inside Germany and abroad. Guerrillas was instinctively secretive, even before he became a spymaster, and more so thereafter. Within the rambling warren of offices in a row of converted mansions on Berlin's Tierpitzufer, where the Abwehr had its headquarters until it was bombed out in 1943, he seemed to glide almost invisibly from one room to another. So he did too on his frequent travels to other countries, especially Spain. A signed portrait of Franco, its dictator, adorned his office wall. He seldom wore uniform, an oddity in Nazi society, which was obsessed with fancy dress. He was elaborately courteous, not least to subordinates, and something of a hypochondriac who took too many pills. He relaxed by riding regularly and playing a smart game of tennis. His passion for animals was much remarked. He was followed around Abwehr headquarters by 2 Dachshunds, to which he talked constantly. One of them once fell ill while Guerrillas was visiting Italy, and he telephoned at length to Berlin to discuss its condition. His Italian companions assumed that he was speaking in code about great issues of state, but his obsession with the dog was authentic. He often said that he trusted animals more than people. It was probably more accurate to say that he liked them better. In conversation, whether professional or social, he was a master of equivocation. Few people were ever sure what Guerrillas really thought, which was supposed by contemporaries to reflect his depth of character. More likely, it masked chronic indecision. Although technically a branch of OKW, the Abwehr quickly became Guerrillas' personal fiefdom. Throughout the war, his men achieved considerable success in suppressing dissent and capturing Western Allied agents operating in Hitler's empire, which did much to sustain the admiral's standing in Nazi high places. Colonel Franz von Bentewegny, who ran counter-espionage, was one of Guerrillas' few impressive subordinate appointments. Yet the Russians were able to sustain their astonishing espionage activities inside Germany until 1942. And military leakages persisted until 1945, even if the huge matter of Germany's broken codes lay beyond Guerrillas' remit. The agents his officers dispatched to gather information abroad were almost all unfit for the role. It is odd that Berlin never attempted to recruit spies to dispatch to Britain who might have passed for gentlemen. Even in 1940, the accent and manners of the upper class remained a passport to social acceptance in Churchill's embattled island. The writer Cyril Connolly wrote an angry letter to the New Statesman, complaining that when he himself was detained as a possible spy, he was immediately released when it was discovered that he had been educated at Eton. The experience of the Cambridge spies, deemed beyond suspicion as members of the upper middle class, suggests that if the Abwehr had dispatched to Britain a few Nazis with passable table manners and some skill as fly casters or grouse shooters, they would have been asked to all the best houses. As it was, however, when 2 of Guerrillas' key men, Colonel Hans Piekenbock, the head of intelligence, and Colonel Erwin Lahausen, head of sabotage, were sacked in 1943, this was no gesture of Nazi spite, made for political reasons. It was a consequence of their obvious incompetence and of their department's failure. German secret operations abroad deployed immense labor for negligible results. One of the Abwehr's most notable recruits was Naval Lieutenant Heinrich Gabers. He was a vegetable farmer's son, a passionate Nazi who in 1938 had sailed across the Atlantic in a 30-foot yacht, the Windspiel, which he constructed himself. Amid the Allied naval blockade, the Germans devised the notion of dispatching agents to far-flung places in sailing boats too humble to attract attention of the enemy. In 1941 and 42, Grievous made epic forays to South Africa and Namibia, respectively. Thereafter, he captained the little schooner Passin, which made 2 immense voyages at an average speed of 6 knots. The boat sailed under the name of the Santa Maria and flew successfully French, Spanish, and Portuguese colors as Grievous deemed appropriate. In 1943, he carried 3 Abwehr men, codenamed Walter, Fred, and Jim, to Argentina, in what he afterwards described laconically as an uneventful voyage of 65 days. In a nautical sense, it may be true that nothing much happened, but the relations on board were poisoned by the mutual loathing of Walter and Fred, while Jim was perpetually prostrate with seasickness, which cost him a drastic weight loss. The passengers were successfully delivered to a reception committee of Argentine sympathizers at Rio de Plata, who presented the Passin's crew with coffee and oranges before the little vessel turned about and sailed home. Grievous, plainly a man of iron, seemed wholly untroubled by his experience. He returned safely to Europe and received the Ritterkreuz. There is no evidence, however, that his passengers contributed anything to the Nazi war effort. Likewise, the Hungarian Air Force officer, Count Laszlo Almazy, crossed 2,000 miles of North African desert to deliver 2 agents to Egypt in May 1942, a remarkable achievement, and Almazy later inspired the novel and film The English Patient. Though its version of this enthusiastic Nazi was fanciful, his passengers, however, did nothing on arrival to justify their epic journey. Nearer home, it became increasingly clear to the British monitoring the Abwehr's wireless reports that its networks of overseas stations and informants produced almost nothing that was both new and true. As Trevor Roper pursued his researches through the ever-growing harvest of Bletchley's decrypts, we soon became aware that the Little Admiral was a far more complex and controversial character than we had supposed. As the incompetence of his organization was progressively revealed to us, we discovered, or deduced, something of the politics in which he was involved, and we noted his feverish travels in every direction, but especially to Spain, which distinguished him sharply from our more sedentary chief, Stuart Menzies. For several decades after the war, Guerrillas was treated as a major figure of the era, the subject of several weighty biographies. The foremost element in the Guerrillas mythology was a claim that he had been a secret crusader against Hitler, who had given active assistance to the Allied cause. Several German writers energetically promoted this view because their post-war society was desperate to identify virtuous men who had dared to raise their hands against the vast evil of Nazism, and suffered martyrdom in consequence. It is now plain that such claims were unfounded. Until 1938, Guerrillas was an ardent supporter of the Nazis, and for years thereafter, Hitler frequently used him as a personal emissary abroad. The admiral worked amicably with Reinhard Heydrich of the RSHA. The two families socialized. Frau Guerrillas and the executive planner of the Holocaust sometimes played the violin together. From 1939 onwards, the admiral became increasingly gloomy and nervous. Colleagues noted him drinking heavily. Trevor Roper regarded it as an absurd delusion that Guerrillas was the directing brain of the other Germany. The Abwehr's chief, in his view, was a man of limited gifts, who confined his anti-Nazi activities to making his organization a haven for officers who shared his rising distaste for Hitler and his supporters, and who resisted active complicity in the Nazis' atrocities. Guerrillas' fastidious nature recoiled from the coarseness of their conduct, perhaps more than from its insensate barbarity. The only Abwehr officer known to have been a source for MI6 was Hans Bernd Gisevius in Switzerland, a Prussian lawyer of giant physical proportions who served 5 years in the Gestapo and hated it, before transferring to the Ministry of Internal Affairs in 1938. and thence to the Abwehr. Canarus sent him to Zurich under diplomatic cover as a vice consul, and thereafter he passed information to Halina Szymanska, whom he knew was an informant for both British and Polish intelligence. Ciphers provided material for 25 reports dispatched from Bern to Broadway between August 1940 and December 1942, some of them citing Canarus's professed opinions. Also among his sources was Hitler's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. Szymanska, the conduit, was the formidable and beautiful wife of the former Polish military attaché in Berlin, and once dined with Canarus in Bern. Much of Vesuvius's material was accurate. In January 1941, Szymanska passed on his report about the German aircraft stocks, together with the Abwehrmann's opinion that an invasion of Britain was off. In April, she quoted Giuseppe's view, based on information from Schacht, that Hitler would invade Russia during the following month, which indeed was then his intention. But as usual with intelligence, the German also passed on some rubbish. On the 28th of March 1941, he told Szymanska that German forces would not take the offensive in Libya, 2 days before Rommel launched a major onslaught. Giuseppe's contribution, and those of a handful of his colleagues, scarcely made the Abwehr a pillar of resistance against the Nazis. Its wartime shortcomings were the product of indolence and incompetence rather than of considered treachery. Canarus was a poor delegator, who chose weak subordinates. German intelligence had one notable success abroad, in suborning Yugoslav officers ahead of their army's 1941 emergency mobilization, in time to sabotage the process. But thereafter, its espionage operations were uniformly unsuccessful. The admiral was nonetheless too much a German patriot actively to assist his country's enemies. Like many such people of the time, he harbored muddled political views. A monarchist and a conservative, Franco's Spain was his spiritual home. He traveled there as often as he could, not merely to visit the large Madrid Abwehr HQ at Calle Claudio Coello 151, but also to commune with like-minded Spanish politicians and grandees. The Abwehr's ship-watching service in Spain, the Unternehmen Boden, monitoring Allied movements through the Straits of Gibraltar with the aid of advanced infrared technology, and reporting them to the Kriegsmarine and the Luftwaffe's Air Fleet 1 in Italy, formed the most impressive element in the organization's overseas operation. Yet, if Canarus bears much responsibility for the shortcomings of Germany's big-picture intelligence, he could never have run an honest operation under the dead hand of Hitler, any more than Moscow Center could do so in the shadow of Stalin. Reports on the condition and prospects of the enemy were permitted to reach conclusions only within parameters acceptable to the Führer. This crippling constraint was symbolized by Hitler's annotation on an important intelligence report about Russia's agricultural conditions. This cannot be. Kat Zeitzler, chief of the Army's General Staff, wrote on the 23rd of October 1942, the eve of Stalingrad, "The Russians no longer have any reserves worth mentioning and are not capable of launching large-scale offensives." Himmler, in 1944, declared without embarrassment that his first requirement from Germany's intelligence service was not truth, but loyalty to the Führer. This was an important statement, the most vivid expression of the huge weakness of the Abwehr and the RSHA throughout the Second World War. Historian Michael Handel has written, "Leaders in a democratic system are generally more inclined to consider a wide variety of options than those who have always functioned within authoritarian or totalitarian political systems. In authoritarian countries, where the climb to the top is an unrelenting struggle for power, habits of cooperation and openness are usually less developed. Tolerance for ideas that deviate from the party line are seen as personal criticism. These features of almost all dictatorships crippled German intelligence activities beyond the battlefield, and sometimes also within it. Himmler's deputy Reinhard Heydrich, for instance, was far more interested in using the RSHA as a weapon against the Nazi Empire's internal enemies than as a means of securing information about its foreign foes. Hitler never wished to use intelligence as a planning or policy-making tool. He recognized its utility only at a tactical level. The Nazis were strikingly incurious about abroad. Yet, the fact that the Abwehr was an unsuccessful intelligence-gathering organization did not mean that Hitler's armed forces were blind on the battlefield. Their access to tactical intelligence was generally good. In the first half of the war, Germany's wireless interceptors and codebreakers enjoyed successes which would today seem impressive, were they not measured against those of the British and Americans. The Wehrmacht had excellent voice monitoring units, which in every theater of war provided important information. The Y service was one of the best sources of intelligence, said Hans Otto Behrendt, one of Rommel's staff in North Africa. In August 1941, aided by an Italian employee, 2 agents of the Sezione Prelevamento, the extraction section of Italian intelligence, opened the safe of the military attaché's office at the U.S. Embassy in Rome. They removed his codebook, Military Intelligence Code Number 11, and photographed it. This enabled the access to read substantial traffic through the ensuing 10 months, and proved a seriously significant intelligence break. In 1942, it had especially grievous consequences for 8th Army in the desert, since the U.S. military attaché in Cairo, Colonel Bonner Fellers, reported in detail to Washington on British plans and intentions. A German intelligence officer paid generous tribute to this incomparable source of authentic and reliable information, which contributed so decisively during the first half of 1942 to our victories in North Africa. At sea, some of the Royal Navy's Ciphers were found aboard the British submarine Seal, captured off the German coast on the 5th of May, 1940, owing to an extraordinary and culpable failure by the mine layers officers to destroy its confidential papers. The Kriegsmarine was able to read much of the Royal Navy's North Sea traffic until August 1940, and some warship communications until September 1941. Throughout the first half of the war, the Kriegsmarine B-Dienst read the Royal Navy's convoy codes, with grievous consequences for Allied shipping losses. Even where the signals could not be decrypted, radio traffic analysis enabled Axis intelligence staffs to judge enemy deployments remarkably effectively, at least until the second half of the war, when Allied commanders became more astute and security conscious. Patrolling, air reconnaissance, and POW interrogations all provided streams of useful data to German operational commanders, as did open source information, enemy newspaper, and broadcast monitoring. In the first phase of the war, until 1942, while the Wehrmacht was triumphant on battlefields across Europe, these sources sufficed to tell its commanders all that they felt they needed to know about the world, and about their enemies. Victories masked the abject human failures of the Abwehr. As long as Germany was winning, why should anyone make trouble about imperfections in the war machine? It was only when Hitler's armies started losing that hard questions began to be asked about the Reich's abysmal political and strategic intelligence. Hitler himself was, of course, much to blame, but Canaris exercised operational responsibility. The admiral fell from grace, though it was by then far too late, probably impossible for reasons institutionalized in the Nazi system, to repair his corrupt and ineffective espionage organization. While anxious not to be a bad man, Canaris lacked the courage to be a good one. Far from being a substantial historical figure, he was a small one, grappling with dilemmas and difficulties far beyond his capabilities. Trevor Roper professed to see a close resemblance between the Admiral and Menzies, his British counterpart. Both men were conservative, honorable, and weak. By a trifling coincidence, Canaris had a mistress in Vienna whose sister was married to Menzies' brother. Trevor Roper came to regard the Abwehr as a mirror image of MI6, with many of the same weaknesses and absurdities. I recognized across the interviewing fog of war old friends of Broadway and Wadden Hall, transmuted into German uniform in the Tirpitz-Ufer, or Advance. The admiral did little to merit his eventual fate at the hand of Hitler's executioners. He frequently talked treason, but did nothing to further it. Far from becoming a martyr to the cause of a good Germany, he was merely an incompetent servant of an evil one. Thank you so much for listening to this reading of Chapter 2 of A Secret War by Max Hastings. I sincerely apologize for the delay in the production of this video. I had run into a couple issues, a couple things in life that sidetracked me. I will hopefully be producing these more regularly, but no promises there. I'll try my best. If you are enjoying the content, do let me know either down below in the comments or with, likes as a feedback. I will be also producing similar content for a while, probably. I mean, this book has 21 chapters, and I've only done 2, so there's 19 more videos to be done. And so, if you're interested in that kind of thing, subscribe. You can suggest future books for me to read in the for future videos and future series. And again, I'll be making a singular, really, really long video that includes all of the previous recordings into one for the entire book for your viewing pleasure. Again, thank you very much. See you guys later. Much love.